ACT-1. The man in the tattered suit. The grand doors of Wellington Private Bank swung open with a whisper, allowing the city's crisp autumn air to chase in after the man who stepped inside. He was old, maybe in his late 60s or early 70s, with skin the color of polished mahogany and deep-set eyes that carried the wisdom of many lifetimes. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and though his posture was slightly stooped, there was an undeniable dignity in the way he carried himself. He wore a dark navy suit, carefully pressed but well worn, with subtle frays along the cuffs. His shoes, though polished, bore the marks of years of use. In his right hand, he held a simple wooden cane, more for style than necessity, and in his left, a folded newspaper, as if he had just come from a quiet morning of reading at the park. The bank's interior was a stark contrast to the understated elegance of the man. It was a palace of wealth. Gilded chandeliers dangled from the ceiling, casting a warm glow on the marble floors. Elegant gold-plated signs directed customers toward investment services, private banking, and high-net-worth account management. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne, a place built for the elite, the powerful, and the privileged. At the center of this grand hall stood a group of young bankers, dressed in tailored Armani suits and silk ties, their shoes gleaming like obsidian under the artificial lights. They stood behind a large reception desk, sipping espresso from porcelain cups, engaged in quiet conversation about stock markets, luxury getaways, and the latest sports cars. Then, they saw him. A subtle shift occurred in the room. The conversation slowed. One of the bankers, a man in his mid-30s with slicked-back blonde hair and an air of self-importance, frowned as he noticed the old man walking toward them. His name was Richard Coleman, a rising star in the firm, known for his ruthless efficiency and even sharper judgment of valuable clientele. To Richard, this man did not look like value. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, his voice neutral but edged with impatience. The old man smiled, undeterred. "Yes, I believe I have a meeting scheduled." Richard arched an eyebrow. "With whom?" The old man's gaze flickered to the gold-lettered plaques on the wall, each bearing the names of the bank's highest-ranking executives. "With your senior management team." A short laugh escaped from one of the other bankers, a younger man with a sleek, modern haircut and a watch that probably cost more than most people's yearly salaries. His name was Ethan Parker, and his smirk was laced with condescension. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think you may be mistaken. This bank doesn't handle walk-ins for executive meetings. Are you sure you have the right place?" The old man remained calm, his smile unwavering. "I'm quite sure." Richard glanced at his colleagues, as if to silently confirm their mutual disbelief. This man, this nobody in an outdated suit, was claiming to have a meeting with executives. It was almost amusing. "Do you have an appointment?" Richard pressed. "Yes." "Under what name?" The old man paused, as if giving them one final chance to recognize him, but their expressions remained unimpressed, almost bored. "Solomon," he said simply. "Solomon Wright." There was no flicker of recognition. No shift in their demeanor. They saw only what their eyes told them, a black man in an old suit, someone who did not belong in their world of tailored perfection. Ethan sighed, setting down his espresso cup. "Look, Mr. Wright, if you're here for a loan, you need an appointment. But unfortunately, we don't cater to small business clients at this branch. Perhaps you should try." Before he could finish, a security guard approached. The guard, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s, gave Solomon a cursory glance before turning to Richard. "Is there a problem here?" Richard exhaled slowly, feigning politeness. "Not a problem, just a misunderstanding. Mr. Wright here claims to have a meeting with our executives, but he's not in our system." The security guard turned to Solomon. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave. This area is for priority banking clients only." Solomon's smile didn't falter. "And what makes you think I'm not a priority client?" Ethan let out a short laugh. "No offense, sir, but this bank serves some of the wealthiest individuals in the country. Our priority clients don't." He gestured vaguely at Solomon's appearance. "Dress like that." Solomon let the words hang in the air, watching as they rippled through the space between them. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the casual certainty with which they had assessed his worth. The security guard stepped forward. "Sir, I won't ask again. You need to leave." For a moment, Solomon simply stood there. He looked at the grand chandelier above him, the polished floors beneath him, the men in their expensive suits, sipping espresso as they decided who was worthy of respect. Then, with a small nod, he turned on his heel and walked out. As the golden doors swung shut behind him, Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Unbelievable. Some people just don't know their place. Richard smirked. Well, at least we handled that quickly. None of them knew what they had just done. None of them realized who they had just thrown out. Because Solomon Wright wasn't just another customer. He was the man who owned the bank. ACT2. The return of power. An hour after being escorted out of his own bank, Solomon Wright returned. This time, he did not come alone. The grand doors of Wellington Private Bank swung open once more, but the atmosphere had changed. The air inside had been light before, filled with quiet laughter and the sound of expensive shoes clicking against marble. Now, a heavy stillness settled over the lobby. The same bankers who had mocked and dismissed him only an hour earlier looked up from their espresso cups and market reports, their faces shifting from casual boredom to confusion. Solomon entered flanked by two individuals. To his right walked Adele Morrison, his longtime personal assistant, an efficient, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, wearing a tailored gray suit and sharp heels. In her hand, she carried a sleek black leather briefcase, the kind that held documents that could change the course of people's lives. To Solomon's left stood Daniel Grayson, the bank's chief operating officer, a tall, imposing man with silver hair and the aura of someone used to wielding power. The receptionist, a young woman with bright red lipstick and an immaculately pressed uniform, gasped audibly when she saw who it was. Her fingers trembled as she tapped on her keyboard, confirming what she already knew. The name Solomon Wright was at the very top of the system, not as a client, but as the sole owner of Wellington Private Bank. The man who had been thrown out like a common beggar was the very man who signed their paychecks. The bankers, including Richard Coleman and Ethan Parker, were still frozen in place, their minds scrambling to understand the situation. Adele was the first to break the silence. She stepped forward, placing the black leather briefcase onto the reception desk with a crisp, decisive sound. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice as sharp as her tailored suit. "We're here for Mr. Wright's meeting. It seems there was an oversight earlier." The receptionist swallowed hard. "Yes, of course, Mr. Wright. I had no idea." Solomon raised a hand, silencing her. His face was calm, but his eyes held something unreadable. He turned to face Richard and Ethan, who still hadn't moved. "Would you like to know my name?" he asked, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey. The two men swallowed, their throats suddenly dry. I believe we may have," Richard stammered, his usual arrogance shattered. Solomon held up a single finger. "No excuses. Just answer the question. Would you like to know my name?" Silence. Then, Solomon's smile returned, slow and knowing. "I am Solomon Wright, owner and chairman of this bank." A cold, sinking realization spread across Richard and Ethan's faces. The man they had mocked. The man they had kicked out. The man they had judged unworthy of even being in their presence. He owned everything around them. Richard felt his stomach drop, his mind grasping for some way to salvage the situation. "Sir, we didn't know. It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Solomon echoed, tapping his cane lightly against the marble floor. "Tell me, how often do these misunderstandings happen? And to whom?" Richard had no answer. Ethan, usually quick-witted, tried to salvage his pride. "It was just your appearance, sir. You didn't seem like the kind of person who..." Solomon raised an eyebrow. "The kind of person who what?" Ethan hesitated. He knew that whatever he said next would either save or destroy his career. "The kind of person who belongs here," Solomon finished for him. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the grand hall like a thunderclap. Ethan lowered his gaze, his bravado gone. Solomon turned slightly, glancing at Daniel Grayson, his COO. "Tell me, Daniel, if a man walks into my bank dressed in an old suit, should he be treated differently than a man in an Armani?" Daniel, ever the strategist, shook his head. "Absolutely not, sir. Every customer, every guest, and every human being should be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what they wear or what we assume about them." Solomon nodded, his gaze returning to the men before him. Exactly. A long silence followed. Then Solomon spoke again, his tone thoughtful. You see, gentlemen, prejudice is an expensive mistake. It blinds you. It makes you see a man's clothing instead of his character. It makes you dismiss the humble while bowing to the arrogant. And, worst of all, it makes you forget one of life's simplest truths. You never truly know who you're speaking to. Richard's palms were sweating. Sir, we are deeply sorry. It was never our intention to. Solomon held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I do not fire people for ignorance, Mr. Coleman. I fire them for refusing to learn. Richard stiffened, his throat tight. Are you willing to learn? Solomon asked. Yes, sir, Richard whispered. Solomon turned to Ethan. And you? Ethan swallowed, nodding quickly. Yes, sir, absolutely. Solomon's smile returned. Slow, knowing, but not unkind. Good. Then we will see if your actions match your words. He turned to Adele. Make arrangements for a mandatory diversity and ethics training program for all employees. Effective immediately. She nodded, already making notes. And one more thing, Solomon added, looking around the lobby at the now silent bankers. From this day forward, I want every person who walks through these doors to be treated with respect. Whether they wear Armani or an old suit, whether they have $1 million or a single dime, respect is not a privilege. It is a right. If I find out that any customer has been dismissed or judged because of appearances, the person responsible will not work here another day. Is that understood? A hushed chorus of, yes, sir, followed. Solomon nodded once. Good. Then, let's get to work. As he turned toward the executive wing, the bankers remained frozen in place, still processing what had just happened. Richard and Ethan exchanged a glance. They had been tested, and they had barely survived. One thing was certain. Wellington Private Bank would never be the same again.